2 years before the Civil War ended, Lincoln started planning for the future of the United States himself. Lincoln's 10% plan offered a pardon to any Confederate who would take oath of allegiance to Union and accept federal policy on slavery. It denied all pardons to all Confederate military and government officials and Southerners who killed African American war prisoners. It also permitted each state to hold a convention to create a new state constitution only after 10% of voters in a state swore allegiance to the Union. States could then hold elections and resume full participation in Union. Congress saw this as a threat to congressional authority. Republican leaders warned Lincoln, and most opposition came from the radical Republicans, who believed the Civil War fought over slavery and insisted Reconstruction should be a total reconstructing of society to guarantee blacks equality.
Radical Republicans wanted revenge and to punish the South for causing the war. They also believed the government should transition freedmen from slavery. They wanted to keep the Republican Party in the North and the South by not allowing the Confederates to vote. They thought the South was dragging their heels in the Reconstruction process and that Lincoln was encouraging the states not to ratify the 14th Amendment. They forced the South to abide by the 14th Amendment and passed the Reconstruction Act in March of 1867. When the war over Reconstruction was still a major conflict waged by the radical Republicans who wanted to punish the South and Southerners to preserve their way of life.
The Reconstruction Act of 1867 put the South under military rule and divided it into 5 districts, which were each controlled by a North General. It ordered the Southern states to hold new elections for delegates and create new state constitutions. It required states to allow all qualified male voters, which also included African Americans, to vote in elections and temporarily banned the Confederacy from voting. It also required Southern states to guarantee equal rights to all citizens and to ratify the 14th Amendment. The idea behind this was reform, not revenge. Historians note that this was a radical act in American history, and the purpose was clearly to punish the South.
After Lincoln's death, Reconstruction was in the hands of a one-time slave owner, Andrew Johnson, who was from the South. His plan reflected the spirit of Lincoln's, but his was more generous towards the South. Although he denied pardons to Confederate leaders, often issued to those who asked by 1865 alone, 13,000 pardoned. He pardoned Southerners who swore allegiance to the Union, permitted each state to hold a constitutional convention without a 10% allegiance requirement, and required states to vote for secession, abolish slavery, and repudiate the Confederate debt, and the states could then hold elections.
As Southern states met, Johnson's Reconstruction demands were restored to the Union. The first order of business of white-run governments was to enact the Black Codes, which were laws that restricted the freedmen's rights and was the closest thing to slavery. They had curfews, which meant blacks couldn't be out past sunset, vagrancy laws, so if a freedman was convicted of not working, he could be fined, whipped, or sold for a year of labor. There were labor contracts which the freedmen had to sign an agreement in January for a year of work, and if they quit before the year was up, they would lose all wages that they earned. And finally, there was the land restrictions, which meant that freed people could only rent land or homes in rural areas, which forced them to live on plantations.
The Northern Republicans were becoming enraged by Southern defiance. Republicans in Congress blamed Johnson for Democratic return to power. Congress then decided to bypass Johnson to put an end to Reconstruction plan, outlaw the Black Codes, and ratify amendments. The 13th Amendment made slavery illegal in the United States and protected the rights of blacks. The slave owners wanted the government to pay for slaves because they were used to cheap labor, and the North wanted blacks to stay in the South because they were afraid they would take jobs and were afraid of discrimination. The 14th Amendment stated that all people born in the United States, including African Americans, are natural citizens and were granted the same rights. African Americans still don't have equal rights, though, and whites don't want them to vote or have power, so they didn't tell them how or when to vote. And finally, the 15th Amendment stated that blacks had voting rights and prohibited governments from refusing citizens to vote based on race and color. Slave states then started passing laws making it harder on them, like poll taxes and reading and writing tests.
With the last of the Civil War amendments having been ratified, African Americans made sure to take advantage of these rights to gain an education for themselves. Prior to these rights, it had been against the law to be elected to public office. In an effort to intimidate Republicans, whites, and African Americans, the KKK became the first terrorist organization. They covered themselves in white robes and hoods and appeared out of nowhere, burning crosses in front of victims' homes and harassing and murdering them. Anyone who didn't share their beliefs could be a victim. KKK sought to eliminate the Republican Party, and their violence kindled northern outrage.
Sharecropping became a major issue when proposals to distribute formerly white-owned land to freedmen received little political support. Few freedmen had the money to buy their own land, and if they did, the whites refused to sell or rent it to them. They found that no man can work another man's land without getting poorer and poorer every day. Under this system, where a farmer tends some portion of the land and receives a share of the crop as payment at the end, employees worked under close supervision and could be fined for missing a single day of work. Many were left in debt because of their dishonest planters who evicted sharecroppers of their pay. This left them in a cycle of debt. Many then switched to tenant farming, where they rented land. This was one step back from sharecropping. In the end, however, became because landlords forced them to buy high-priced supplies.
As Reconstruction continued, African American civil rights became harder to guarantee. Congress made one last attempt to guarantee their rights by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This, however, proved to be unconstitutional. The Equal Protection Clause prohibits discrimination by the state, but it never gave the federal government the power to prohibit discrimination individually. Because it was not specific enough, private business owners took advantage of it and began to separate blacks and whites. They argued that it was separate but equal, but soon America realized that separate does not and will not ever mean equal. The 13th Amendment was intended to eliminate the badge of slavery, not to necessarily ban discrimination in public places. All persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, faculties, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law, and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition or servitude. Congress did not have the power to regulate private segregation.
Even after Reconstruction, African Americans' freedoms began to disappear. In the South, the line of color was clearly drawn in all aspects of daily life. Many states had instituted a system of legal segregation. Blacks and whites were separated in schools, parks, public buildings, hospitals, and transportation systems. Facilities designed to blacks were made sure to make them feel inferior to whites. In the Plessy v. Ferguson case, Homer Plessy argued about his right to equal protection of the laws when they were violated by a Louisiana law that required separate seating for whites and blacks on public railroads. But what does it mean to be equal? In the Plessy v. Ferguson case, equality for blacks was in a separate but equal form to those of whites. Many hear the word equal and assume it means the same. But what if two men went to a hospital with headaches where only ibuprofen could be prescribed? What if one had a brain tumor? The equal part in separate but equal was hard to enforce, and African Americans in the South rarely ever saw equality. So it's a no-brainer that Reconstruction didn't rebuild the United States. It was in fact a failure.